Good morning and good afternoon for who's watching overseas. I'm Paulo, and we are the International Relations Research Center from the University of São Paulo. And today we are glad to have here Professor Cristina Pecequilo and Professor Tom Long for discussing with us the United States perspective on Latin America during the second Trump administration. And please feel mostly welcome to ask questions during the presentations. And I hope we have a very good debate today. So on January 20th, 2025, Donald Trump was sworn in as the 47th president of the United States of America after receiving 49.8% of popular vote against 48.3% received by his adversary, Kamala Harris, a difference of a bit more than 2 million votes, and after getting 212 electoral votes, surpassing with a large margin the 270 necessary to win, Trump returned to the White House after having been the 45th president of the United States and have been defeated by Joe Biden in 2020. On April 2nd, 2025, Trump signed the Executive Order 257, regulating imports with a reciprocal tariff to rectify trade practices that contribute to large and persistent annual United States good trade deficits. The document targeted a plethora of countries around the world and set the tone of a more confrontational and transactional foreign policy the new president would pursue. Undoubtedly, the most targeted country with tariffs was China, but Latin America was also present in the list, Brazil being mentioned twice as a country that applied more tariffs on the United States than the other way around. The clearer traits of Trump's second mandate, however, would come some months later in December when the White House published the American National Security Strategy. According to the document, the Monroe Doctrine would again be reasserted and enforced in the Western Hemisphere, denying non-hemispheric competitors, quote, ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities, unquote. The United States would enlist established friends in the region in order to control migration, stop drug flows, and strengthen stability and security on land and sea. Almost 1 month after releasing its national security strategy, the United States conducted an operation in Caracas, capital of Venezuela, where it captured the then president Nicolas Maduro and took him to New York, where he was indicted for drug, weapons, and narco-terrorism charges before the U.S. federal court. After being criticized about the operation by Gustavo Petro, the Colombian president, Trump replied that Petro could be the next. By the end of January 2026, the United States Department of War published the American National Defense Strategy. According to the document, the abandonment of the Western Hemisphere by previous American administrations left as heritage a huge number of illegal aliens to the United States, while the region was terrified by narco-terrorism, making the US less secure. Maduro's abduction was, according to the document, an attempt to deal with this kind of situation and bring America back to the lead of its region again. Still this year, Trump has suggested a friendly takeover of Cuba, sanctioning the country with oil blockades, sanctions, and even a murder indictment against former leader Raul Castro. In a visit to the American base in Guantanamo last Wednesday, the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said that the United States would consider Cuba's acquisition of weapons from Iran or Russia as an invitation to conflict. This brief recollection of events, along with the rise of right-wing governments in the region and a number of elections to occur in the next months, including the Brazilian general elections, brings on the important task to understand the American perspectives for Latin America. Bearing in mind that the International Relations Research Center at the University of São Paulo is honored to have two brilliant scholars to help us with this task. I would like to thank Professor Cristina Pecequilo and Professor Tom Long for accepting our invitation and for being here today discussing such an important theme. Cristina Pecequilo holds a PhD in political science from the University of São Paulo. She's a professor at the Federal University of São Paulo, where she lectures on international politics. She's also affiliated with the graduate program Santiago Dantas in São Paulo. And among her interest topics are American foreign policy and Brazilian foreign policy and great powers, both traditional and rising ones. Professor Tom Long is a professor of international relations at the University of Warwick and profesor afiliado in the División de Estudios Internacionales at Centro de Investigación y Docencias Económicas in Mexico. He's also the coordinator of the Latin America Center, Latin America at Warwick Network. He is interested in asymmetrical relations in IR, focusing on Latin America and inter-American relations. We thank you once again. As we have agreed, we start with Professor Cristina's considerations, and afterwards we go for Tom. Thank you very much. Professor Cristina, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulo, for this introduction. I would like to extend my good mornings, my good afternoons, and my good nights for everybody, because I guess there are people that are going to watch us late on night, and I hope we don't give you nightmares, but this is the point. This is the likeness of internet, that we are going to be able to reach you anytime, any soon. So, Paulo, thank you for also the invite, and to Marcilia, who invited also my presence here, and also for the technical support that the International Relations Research Center of the University of São Paulo is giving us. I'm going to make a brief presentation in my timeline. I have put forward a presentation that is more general, but I'm going to try to pinpoint some issues that I considered important. And I'm going to try to go deeper in some of them, but also the challenge is to talk about perspectives. But when we talk about Trump, we have to put things into context. Why? Because Trump is so often seen as a novelty, he's seen as someone erratic that has no strategy. And I always say that he has this predictable unpredictability. So we're always waiting for him to do something new. And when he launched, as Paulo mentioned, the National Security Strategy in 2025, and he mentioned the Donroe Doctrine, the corollary, as also stated in the doctrine, a lot of people said, oh my God, this is such a surprise. Trump is a bully. Well, there are controversies about that. But the thing is, many of the things that are put in the National Security Strategy were heritages from his first mandate. So I think that we have to go back first in order to see perspectives and try also to pinpoint that between Democrats and Republicans, there are not so many differences regarding Latin America. So I'm going to make a presentation trying to argue that Trump is a continuity of many US policies in the region, but also he is a novelty in the way things are being put, not because the US is strong, but because the US is weak. So this is the kind of idea that I'm going to try to pass to you. First of all, I think that we're going to start with the most obvious statements. The shadow of hegemony that relies on the Western Hemisphere. Since the first release of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, Latin America is seen as part of the US territory, the backyard, as many say, the security network, the sphere of influence, and the natural geopolitical and geoeconomic space that is linked to the US presence in this geographic territory. It's a fact of nature. We're not going to change it here in the Western Hemisphere, and we must learn how to work with it. Geopolitics, geoeconomics, you must understand what is going on. So, first of all, what's going on is that we're in US territory for them because this is a geographical contiguous area. So, since the Monroe Doctrine, the idea of the American for the Americans, there were some priorities established towards the Western Hemisphere. The maintenance of democratic governance and stability, and the containment of intra and extra-regional powers. So, foreign powers that could be here trying to influence politics that are not countries from the Western Hemisphere, and even countries within the Western Hemisphere that could harm US interests in the region. So anything that can be seen as a threat can be contained. So it also leads to the containment of political and economic integration projects. So the idea was to preserve stability, but mostly stability understood as US interests in the hemisphere. I'm not going, of course, to make a historical rendition of all of this, but suffice to say that during the 2 centuries that we're seeing this strategy, this moral doctrine in place, the US has different tactics for doing this. Sometimes they talk about cooperation, sometimes they talk about intervention, and they do not only talk about intervention, they intervene in the region militarily, politically. So it's a constant presence in the region. It varies from historical presidencies to presidencies. So when Roosevelt goes into power during the Second World War, Franklin Roosevelt, no Teddy Roosevelt, but Franklin Roosevelt, he says, oh, we're going to have a good neighbor policy. Then we come to George H. Bush, he says, no Monroe Doctrine anymore in the post-Cold War world. Obama says the same. So that's the point. We're going to see different presidents from different parties trying to pinpoint Latin America, the Western Hemisphere, as a priority, which is not, especially after the Second World War. Eurasia is a priority. And then we're going to have adjustments from Democrats, from Republicans, but the fact remains the same. That's what I always say. The shadow of hegemony and the priorities do not change. They are linked to this vision that was put forward in the moral doctrine. So the maintenance of democratic governance and stability, of course, understood in US patterns, and the containment of powers that are going to threat US interests in the region, and also to contain political and economic integration projects that may harm US interests. So this is a constant in US history. But our focus is Trump. So as I said in the beginning, many people were very concerned. Oh my God, a new doctrine. Trump is going to do so many things here. This is a novelty. Trump 2 is much worse than Trump 1. No. Everything that is put forward in the National Security Strategy of 2025 was already present in the first Trump's government, not only in the National Security Strategy of 2017, but also in specific documents regarding the Western Hemisphere. What we have today is the inversion of priorities, and this, I think, is one of the most important things that we're going to talk about here in this space, and also how the US is feeling towards its competitors, not only local competitors, maybe such as Brazil, but also focused mostly on China. So we have to go back to Trump 1 to try to focus on the new doctrine that Donald Trump put forward, which is a doctrine that is linked to the idea of the Monroe Doctrine. And when he says in 2025, Trump corollary, his remembrance is the other Roosevelt corollary, not Franklin, but Teddy, when he says that America is going to be very present in the Western Hemisphere. This is a little bit of common knowledge, but I think it's important for us to present this context, this framework. So what did Trump do for the Western Hemisphere during his first mandate from 2017 until 2020, remembering that this was a period of very much interesting facts, such as the pandemics, such as his controversial election, and so on. But I think that we must focus on these 5 strategic pillars for the hemisphere. First of all, the idea of the Monroe Doctrine revival was already present in these documents. He also stated here that the first priority of U.S. foreign policy for Latin America was the security of the American territory. So it was already being said that the region represented multidimensional threats for the U.S., such as migration, drug trafficking, and organized crime, aka terrorist organizations, since the definition of the Department of State and of the Department of Defense at that time, now Department of War. So it's kind of common knowledge that goes back to the past. The second thing, and this, Trump was one of the first to confront China's challenge in the region, was the priority given to economic growth and free markets. So there was an NAFTA update, and it became United States, Mexico, Canada. So the US would have more advantages. This was also included in the first trade wars that Trump was enduring during his first mandate, not in the same pattern, not in the same fashion that is being done in his second mandate, but it was already present. So the NAFTA, as we knew it, was transformed into USMCA. But this is not the most relevant for me. I would like to pinpoint for you that the most relevant stuff was the project that did not went forward, that was called América Crece, and in English, Growth in the Americas. This was the first attempt to confront China in the areas that she is being present in Latin America. Which were these areas? Infrastructure, development aid, and also the presence of Chinese transnational companies in the regions, and also multilateral alliances such as the BRICS, such as the Belt and Road Initiative that from 2018 was beginning to set foot on the region. So this project was an initiative of the American state, but together with private companies, that was trying to envision an agenda of development for Latin America. Of course, an agenda that would benefit the US, but would try to fight China's back in this kind of agenda of development. What was the problem? There was no money for it, there was no interest for it, but it was a first idea put forward on the table. This is very important because there is a thing that Trump always says about previous governments that were in place in the US. There was a neglect of Latin America. So this was the first time that a project was trying to not show neglect towards the region, but to show some kind of opportunity of growth. So as I said, it doesn't have any concrete agendas. There was no products attached to it, but it was put forward. And I think it's important to remember it because it was one of the first offensives put forward by Trump. But we tend mostly to focus on security and also on the political side. The third pillar is that to reassure the region's commitment with democracy and the law. These are the US words, not mine, so I'm just putting it for you as they said. And the focus was obviously against Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and the ghost of communism that is already present. So this was also linked to the 50th objective that was to enlarge and strengthen the regional community of allies, the idea of like-minded partners. This was linked, and still is, to the transnational right and conservative movement that is present in Latin America, and also to geocultural and geosocial wars that were linked to cooptation of national and fractured elites. The idea also is that, and it also happens in Brazil, that I'm going to stress in the end of my presentation, that the US does not have to force his hand a lot in some nations. There is a cultural and social movement that supports the US and supports alignment to the US. So this is a kind of agenda that is easier to explore because the transnational right is united, but also because you have this historical and cultural links that date back to the future, that date back to the beginning of the 20th century and the history of mostly of Latin American countries. Still, and not least, last but not least, I'm going back to the fourth component because it's related to China. So you have political agendas, security agendas, and you also have economic agendas, as I mentioned, with America Cresce and the update of NAFTA, which is to contain economic aggression and evil political influence. You could notice that even the language that was used in Trump 1 was similar that the one which is being used now. So these are the 5 pillars. So there is, you see, everything is here. Everything that is going to be in the National Security Strategy of 2025 was already present. However, Trump was not able to stay in government, I think mostly because of the pandemics. And then we have the Joe Biden gap. I'm not going to be very thorough on this, but I'd like to put Biden here to present the difference, but also the similarities between the two governments. Which is the difference? The difference is the rhetoric of cooperation instead pressure, but again, the development as a priority was on the table with other projects, not America Cresce, but with the project Build Back Better World, that was not also a project with future. It was put forward in the G20 meeting, but it was not deepened. And also a very irrelevant project because it was linked only to smaller countries in the region, which was called America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. Brazil was not included, only countries that were not very relevant in the economic scenario of Latin America. And once more, the problem remains. The US has no financial resources to promote development in the region. And I think that is very usual to Democrats. Democrats focus mostly on social issues agendas, environment, democracy, human rights. So you have Summit of the Americas, support for the democratic regime, migration reform, and geopolitical containment was not abandoned. He just changed tactics. Venezuela, Cuba, and the containment of China and the Belt and Road Initiative were very present here. But again, Biden was not an aggressive type. He was a nice guy. People like to say, oh, Biden is a nice guy. He's going to the Amazon. He's going to put forward the migration reform. But as we know, containment was also in place. Cuba was feeling pressures. Venezuela was feeling pressures. And then all the projects of development were put forward, but they were not implemented. Remembering that Biden was much more interested in the wars in Europe, with the support for Ukraine, the idea of involvement in the Middle East from 2023 onwards, with Israel Gaza Strip crisis. And so the Latin America part of the US agenda was put on side. This would change with the second Trump's government. So what we're going to have here is that the gap that Biden represented was filled once more with Trump trying to bring the US more present in the continent. So I think that when we talk about Trump 2, we have to talk about the intermestic Latin America and present two phases for Trump policies in the region. First, the first phase is from January till November 2025, is what I call the idea of the Latin America from within and without. So that the fight against evil influences that may come from the region are going to be fought against inside the US. And this is, I'm talking about the multidimensional threats. And they were presented by Michael Rubio in several opportunities, Rubio as Secretary of State. The idea of drugs, the idea of migration, the idea of enemies coming to the US, thugs, and so on. So Trump was trying to fight two wars, the wars against illegal migration, organized crime within the US, but also within the region itself. So it's going to put pressure on the countries of the region to try to regain some sort of US influence and also to please his electorate that was concerned with illegal migration, drug trafficking, and organized crime. These three issues, these three multidimensional threats, are always present in the US. They, as I said, Democrats and Republicans changed tactics, but this is always present, and this was already present in the 5 pillars strategy. But one of the main issues that is mostly concerning for Trump is China's threats. The advance of the Belt and Road Initiative in the region, bilateral relations with Brazil, how China and Brazil are developing a relation that is becoming structural for Brazil's US foreign policy and its economy. Not only the US would have this structural influence, but also China, and also Brazil is also involved in tech and trade wars related to the advancement of China presence in the region. So this is a new reality that China is present. It's very different from Trump's one. China is here, China is not leaving, because there is a higher level of dependence on China's economy for local economies. Brazil is the specific case that I'm going to talk about in this last part of my presentation. So this is very concerning for Brazil, because Brazil is today is dependent on the US less than it was some years ago, but also dependent on China. So Trump's pressures, Liberation Day, tariffs, and so on, they do not have only an economic side, but also a political side on pressing Brazil on other issues. So we come to the second phase when you have the Trump corollary, which is from December onward. So the idea that the US is going to stop neglecting the agenda in the hemisphere and also deny non-hemispheric competitors to stay here. I'm not going to read this. As I said, Paulo also put it forward in his brief presentation in the beginning, but this is the idea. So we have to be present, us, US, in the region, so that the region is not going to be a threat anymore to us. This is a sign, as I said, of weakness, not as a sign, not a sign of strength. And again, this is the first time that Latin America in the last 2 decades is put in the first priority list of Trump's agenda, of the US agenda. Of course, the US has interest in all over the world. It's the hegemonic power, but it's interesting to see that Eurasia now is number 2, and Latin America is number 1. Doesn't change much, as you're seeing in Iran and other regions, but it's important to shed this light on this change. So what is happening? You have this doctrine, and I think that we must understand that it's not only related to political issues, not only related to the dangers Latin America represents from within and without, but also to overlapping issues related to US problems domestically, which is the US reindustrialization process, the role that Brazil and Latin America can play in this as consumers, but also as I say, a reserve to the US, a market reserve, a commodities reserve in its sphere of influence. And the main threat, again, is China. It's impossible to talk about US policies in the region without mentioning China, because some of the policies are directly related to the countries in the region, but also they have a proxy effect. It's a proxy war, direct or indirect, cold or hot, towards China. So the US is focusing on trying to establish friendly shoring here, near shoring, and also see this region as a reserve, as its sphere of influence, as always. So what we're talking about it here, we're talking about food security and also critical minerals and the rare earth elements. I'm not going to mention others agendas, but I would like to focus on this too, because Brazil is important player in both. It may sound weird, exquisite to put food security here, but the US imports a lot of its food. It has a very strong agricultural sector. It's a very important interest group law there. So you have farm bills and so on, but also it does not make everything the US needs, and the prices are not so competitive. So he has to import. And also critical minerals and rare earth elements, as they created recently the Project Volt in order to stock this, because they don't have this, and China and Brazil has. So coming to the end of my presentation, what we see now is an ongoing offensive. Venezuela intervention, Cuba blockade and threats, organized crime as terrorism. So this is a intervention, political intervention here in the region, but as I said, a proxy war also against China. We're seeing the framework of the Shield of the Americas, which is a political and military strategy, an alliance that has the potential to pressure what the US defines as non-friendly and non-reliable countries. Also, the new increase of the far right and political and economic elites alliances. Also, as I mentioned, political interference and pressures, and also the usage of the trade wars as means to put additional political pressure. Multilateralism is on hold regionally and globally. So I think this is an idea that the US is here. The US is present. It always has been. The shadow of hegemony is present, but also it's changing its postures. And for countries like Brazil, this is a very heavy stuff to deal with. So what we have here? We have here prospects that call our attention that we need to be more careful for Brazil in this hegemonic transition. We live in an era of unstable multipolarity. We live also in an era, and this is what factors the most, of US-China competitive coexistence. Latin America is a disputed and unstable ground. Brazil is a pillar in this dispute. Bargain for Brazil is a possibility, but for us to bargain, as we did with Franklin Roosevelt in the Good Neighbor policy in the beginning of the Second World War, we have to have a national project. And every country in Latin America, in the hemisphere, does not have a national project in place. We are seeing polarized society models everywhere. We're seeing this with the US weight and attraction. Elections 26, not only in Brazil, but in other countries, are very divided. So not only the US is weak, but also the political forces in Latin America. time I see an election here in Latin America and the right wins, everybody says, oh, this is very good for the US. The right, the far right is gaining ground. Brazil is going to be encircled because he's the only one with a progressive government. But every election is very tight. We're seeing this in the late election in Peru, where whoever gains the presidency, wins the presidency, it's a very tight win. Here in Brazil, Lula's win were also the same. Argentina and so on, every side is weak. So there is no right-wing win and a right-wing tight. Also, when the left wins, the progressive forces win, there's no new pink tight because everything is very, very tight. And why is this? Because the countries are reliving a period of economic crisis. They have two powers that are fighting for spaces here in the region, US and China. This is the focus. This is why Trump is doing what is doing here, not also added to the other prospects of the moral doctrine also, so that you have foreign powers and domestic powers. But we have to be clear. This is happening because we don't have a national project clear as we should have, and we're not focusing on what we need. We need development, we need social agendas, and we have to understand, again, the weakness is everywhere. The weakness is in Latin America, the weakness in US offensive, and we have to put forward projects. But in polarized society models, this is very difficult. There is, in Latin America, and the US and China are part of this. We cannot talk about Latin America, US, and countries in Latin America without talking about China. China is the focus, Brazil is the focus, other nations too, but we have to see that the region and Brazil is dependent on both. So what we have to do, which are the perspectives, which are the focus? Chaos is going to increase. This is an unstable world. This is an unstable region. So we have to be careful, and we have to pay attention to elections 2026. What's going to happen? Which are the projects? Where is Brazil going? And we have to be sure that instability is the rule. So I'm finishing my presentation here. I do not have answers for you. I do not have clear prospects to present to our audience, but I would also like to present mostly these are some of my productions, books in Portuguese, but I would also like to call your attention to Austral. Austral is a bilingual journal published by the Center of Brazilian Strategy, International Relations of Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, and many of the things that I talked here are present there. And I would like to finish saying that the strength of Brazil and Latin America is cooperation within the geopolitical South and resistance towards the US. How we're going to do this in a scenario of dependence is very difficult. So thank you once more, and I finish my presentation here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Professor Cristina. And now, no gaps, we go for Professor Tom Long. Thank you once again, Professor, and we're here to listen to you now.
Great, thank you so much, Paulo, for the invitation to be here and for the introduction, and to USP for hosting this. Cristina, I really enjoyed your talk, and I think actually, though we didn't plan it, I think fits together well. It's sort of the broad overview that you gave sets some context, because I'm going to focus on something a little bit narrower. I also wanted to mention that I'm drawing here on a piece that's forthcoming in the French journal L'année des Relations Internationales, which should be out later this year. So the last year, I think, has left no doubt. The United States' famous big stick is back. In addition, of course, to the January 3rd attack on Caracas and the capture of Nicolás Maduro, there have been a host of unilateral military actions across the hemisphere, not to mention in Iran, perhaps most consequentially. There have been some 60 reported bombardments of small boats, killing as many as 200 people with very limited justification, effectively extrajudicial killings on alleged but unproved charges that these are drug traffickers. There was an earlier partial blockade of Venezuela that has been followed by an aggressive and multifaceted campaign against Cuba, where I don't think actually there are sort of significant strategic interests, but there are big domestic political interests for the United States and an enactment of what Abe Lowenthal long ago called the U.S. hegemonic presumption. That has been all part of a broader expansion of the use of U.S. military force in counter-narcotics operations, which has been seen perhaps most notably in Ecuador, more subtly and threatened less subtly in Mexico. We've seen threatened interventions, one against Panama in the State of the Union address, at the beginning of the Trump administration, repeated threats against Canada, Greenland, Mexico, Colombia, and the list goes on and on. These interventions and threats, I think, are at once shocking and very familiar. There's shock and spectacle involved in them. The operation in Caracas in particular seemed to be, and was, according to Trump himself, sort of made for TV or for producing perhaps viral clips. The spectacle of these interventions seems to be part of the point, to show off the awe-inspiring capabilities of the US military. The threats that Trump leverages frequently on social media, to the press, and elsewhere are clearly meant to generate headlines as well as to generate uncertainty about what the United States is going to do, as Cristina alluded to. The shift, I think, is not just a return to intervention, but a much more aggressive and unilateral weaponization of asymmetry. Asymmetry, of course, is not new, nor is intervention. Asymmetry has been, I think, the sort of the characterizing feature of U.S. Latin American relations for more than a century. But the social and practical meaning of asymmetry, the relational effects that it has, can vary quite considerably. Also, and this is what I'm going to argue a bit more, I think these interventions have been effectively separated from the narratives in which they tend to be situated. So although these interventions are shocking in many ways and meant to shock, they look familiar to anyone with a passing familiarity of the history of U.S. Latin American relations. There is probably no more cliched image of the United States in Latin America than that of a colossal Uncle Sam brandishing a club against his supposedly misbehaving neighbors. So when the United States president calls for U.S. firms to exploit Venezuelan oil and minerals, the historical echoes are deafening. For me, and again here I agree with Cristina, these interventions most resemble the period of the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. At that point, the United States often intervened to oust leaders. It hoped to run, to use a word that Trump used himself, to run countries from offshore at a low cost. That rarely worked. When local actors inevitably diverged from the United States preferences because they had their own domestic politics, the United States would often find itself pulled back in and struggle to run those countries from offshore. This is an argument about the Roosevelt corollary that I developed in a little bit more depth in a piece in Foreign Policy with Karsten Schultz that we published a few months ago. In those cases, repeatedly, threats became interventions, interventions then morphed into occupations, and occupations became quagmires from which the United States struggled to extract itself. It's easy enough, I think, to point to these historical parallels or to position Donald Trump within an old pattern of US unilateralism. The more challenging question for me is this: if US intervention is so familiar, then why was Trump's intervention in Venezuela, as well as his campaigns elsewhere, why are they so shocking? And here I think we need to go beyond historical parallels and ask what, if anything, makes the interventions of the second Trump administration different. I want to argue that what makes the behavior of the second Trump administration feel so disconcerting, so unsettling to many of us, is that these interventions effectively lack a narrative. And indeed, Donald Trump refuses to narrate them. By narrative here, I mean, in a sense, a grand storyline. A narrative is a plot that does more than just justify individual acts as legal or necessary. We've seen some efforts at that from the Trump administration, though even there inconsistently. A narrative, beyond that, defines the actors. It gives disparate facts and actions a meaning. Narratives make actions seem more predictable, although often just in retrospect. Katja Freystein and co-authors recently wrote that, quote, in foreign policy, narratives are essential to delegitimize political projects or to legitimize them, providing coherence by linking the past, present, and future. Foreign policy narratives, I would say, matter for both domestic and foreign audiences. Narratives connect power to principle, or perhaps more cynically, one could say that they cloak power with principle. For domestic audiences, narratives permit violence in their name. And I think this is an important and recurring feature of US foreign policy in particular. They permit violence while sustaining claims to the state's moral virtue. For audiences in other countries, a great power's narratives also matter. Indeed, they can facilitate alliances and create spaces for alignment with that great power. Ronald Krebs, a scholar of US foreign policy, particularly security policy, writes that, quote, dominant narratives of US national security establish the common sense givens of a debate. They set the boundaries of the legitimate, limit what political actors inside and outside the halls of power can publicly justify, and resist efforts to remake the landscape of legitimation. And in that specific sense, I want to argue that Trump is effectively refusing to narrate US interventions in Latin America and beyond, indeed. Precisely because what he wants to avoid doing is setting the boundaries of the legitimate. But this lack of narratives is disconcerting, and I think also is incurring political costs. For us as an audience, it makes interventions seem random or unpredictable, even when they aren't. That is the predictability of Donald Trump's unpredictability, as Cristina said. Narratives in foreign policy are related to justifications. And indeed, I think even here, the administration has been inconsistent and mostly insouciant when it comes to providing justifications for the use of force. When asked, Trump asserted to a reporter from the New York Times that he did not need international law, and the only constraint was his own morality. For anyone who has watched over the years Donald Trump's business dealing, his relationships with women, the idea that his only constraint is his morality and conscience is hardly reassuring. Catherine Sickink, writing about the second Trump administration, wrote that the indifference to justification provides, in effect, the real threat to international norms. Norms, Sikkink says, can survive violations when actors feel compelled to justify their breaches. Norms are in fact violated all of the time. But when actors no longer bother to justify those violations, the norms are in trouble. Now, I don't want this argument about the lack of narrative to be understood to mean that there are no patterns, structures, or consistent drivers of US foreign policy. Indeed, I agree there are some significant consistencies across the last three administrations. And those are, in great part, a response, though different responses to the rise of China. In part, those sorts of factors also explain the resurgence of certain tropes like the Monroe Doctrine, though I can come back to it. I don't think that this has coalesced into a narrative that ties together, gives meaning to the Trump administration's interventions. But despite these structural drivers, the second Trump administration, I would argue, has behaved quite differently than the first Trump administration or from Biden, despite some similarities in places like the national security strategy. I can come back a little bit more to these drivers later if there's time, and also to some of the, I think, the possible range of responses from states in the region. But I want to sort of explore in a little bit greater depth this question of narrative. Trump then has been relatively indifferent to justification. Perhaps where this is most obvious is in the repeated attacks on bombings of small boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific, where there has been a half-hearted attempt to produce a legal justification, but not one that any international legal scholar really takes seriously. So instead of narrative, instead of justification, instead of principle, Trump is insisting basically on an alignment with power. Power here is self-justifying for the Trump administration. This, I think, was particularly evident in the Shield of the Americas meeting that was held in Miami a couple of months ago. At that meeting, in which there were more than a dozen, I think, heads of state from Latin America and the Caribbean, only one country was given the right to speak, and that was, of course, the United States. The other heads of state were there effectively to applaud. This was, for me, in the anniversary of the Congress of Panama of 1826, the bicentenary, that is, a shocking breach of what had been some fundamental Latin American norms of multilateralism around universal participation and sovereign equality. But at that meeting, proclaiming this self-justifying nature of U.S. power, he said that, quote, "The heart of our agreement, the Shield of the Americas, is a commitment to using lethal military force." That is, it is military power, the willingness to use it, the willingness to kill, that brings together the Shield of the Americas. Of course, past US presidents have repeatedly used force across the world and in Latin America. That is not new. They have often done so unilaterally. Also, what Trump is doing in that sense has many precedents, even if it is somewhat of a break from the general behavior of post-Cold War US administrations. But when doing so, US presidents have offered justifications for those actions in a narrow sense, that they are legal and necessary. And they have also repeatedly tried to connect them to broad narratives about the US role in the region and in the world. For example, in the 1989 invasion of Panama, which is perhaps the instance to which the capture of Maduro has been most frequently compared, Manuel Noriega was not the official head of state. That is, it did not breach that particular legal norm in the same way as the arrest of Maduro. But still, the Bush administration sought to justify this use of military force with immediate justifications of its necessity and a casus belli, effectively, and to connect the invasion to grand narratives, in particular around democratization and justice. Indeed, the operation was called Operation Just Cause, which is quite a contrast with many of the names that have been given to operations in the Trump administration. We also saw those narratives of democratization, human rights, liberal internationalism, effectively, being rolled out to explain the U.S. occupation of Haiti in 1994, even though the driving cause of that might have been stopping migration coming from Haiti. The myriad interventions of the United States in Latin America in the Cold War, both overt and covert, were also tied to grand narratives, not just of strategic competition with the Soviet Union, where there have been in the Trump administration references to competition with China in the national security strategy and elsewhere as a rationale. But in the Cold War, these were also tied to narratives about competing value systems. Those narratives told the faithful in the United States and throughout the region, its anti-communist allies, that the United States was, in short, a good actor, that its violence, its breaches of international law, were ultimately not just necessary, but righteous. At the opening of the 20th century, we can look back and see what was at that moment a new world power trying to construct narratives about its role in the world and the place of U.S.-Latin American relations within that. Those were intimately connected to a dramatic expansion of the use of U.S. military force, particularly off the North American continent. Of course, there had been previous expansive uses of military force, first of all against Native Americans, secondly against European empires, and third against Mexico in 1846 to 1848. But the use of U.S. military force beyond the territories that it sought to integrate did signal a shift around 1898. The United States at that moment, under the Roosevelt corollary, intervened, but it did so calling itself a police power. It intervened, it argued, because its tutelage was more righteous, better, more Republican, more democratic than that of European debt collectors. This plays out in 1895 and at other moments in Venezuela. So even as Theodore Roosevelt and his successors launched interventions, Roosevelt's Secretary of State, Elihu Root, was building a narrative of cooperation and international law. As Root tried to lay out this vision of international law, Pan-Americanism, closely linked to Pan-Americanism, he was not saying that the United States would not be a police power. He was trying to lay out the laws that the United States would enforce. And in the construction of that project, Root had tremendous support from some Latin American countries, perhaps more than any other from Brazil, but also to an extent, more caveated extent from Argentina and from Chile. Writers like Rubén Darío or José Enrique Rodó, José Martí, chafed at U.S. interventions, but other politicians found much to praise. So yes, all of those narratives were attempts to disguise the use of U.S. power, but I would argue that they operate as more than just fig leaves. They have a purpose for domestic and international audiences. But Trump, in his second administration in particular, seems opposed to trying to tie his interventions to any consistent narrative, old or new. And in particular, there has been a rejection from the administration of the narratives around things like, say, the promotion of democracy abroad. When some officials within the administration have tried to invoke some of these familiar plots, and we've seen this happening with Venezuela, e.g., that the United States has a plan eventually to promote democracy in Venezuela by ousting authoritarians, Trump has largely ignored that or contradicted it, coming out in his immediate press conference saying effectively it was all about the oil. Some strategists in the Trump administration and outside have suggested that all of this is about limiting China or limiting Russian influence in the hemisphere, but Trump's own approach to those powers has been inconsistent, to say the least. And I think some of the uses of U.S. military force have rather limited strategic implications for China or for Russia. They might sympathize with the plight of Cuba, like having Cuba there as an annoyance to the United States, but I think that often the strategic importance to them of Cuba is overstated. So there are, as I mentioned, and I'll be brief here, structural drivers behind some of the similarities of these policies. Cristina talked about these already quite a bit, and I don't want to repeat her. So clearly China is central to reshaping aspects of U.S. policy. On this, I would just note that increasingly, this is being labeled a new Cold War. This is something maybe we can talk about. I think that is a terrible analogy. I don't think U.S.-Chinese competition today resembles the Cold War, at least the U.S.-Soviet Cold War, very, very closely. But it is really important to understand that many in Washington, D.C. think it does, or they find at least instrumental value in that narrative. And I think it has consequences. The metaphor has consequences for policymaking, even if it's a bad metaphor. We also see there sort of the return of discussion of the Monroe Doctrine, which has a great deal to do with China, though perhaps more to do with United States feelings that its own kind of hegemonic role had slipped. We have this focus on enlisting and expanding, though interestingly, I think much of that has been less directed at China than it has been focused on enlisting and expanding ideological sympathies, and in particular, countries that cooperate with U.S. domestic priorities on drugs and migration. We've also seen, and Cristina alluded to this, a return of industrial policy as a sort of structural driver that is leading to a degree of commonality across the last three administrations. And I think those three factors would continue to be there in the next administration in the United States. Just briefly, then I want to say a word about the range of responses that we've seen from Latin American states. We've seen a relatively, I think, diverse range of responses. So this is a great set of cases for comparative foreign policy analysis. But what we have not seen, which I think many in Latin America, perhaps particularly kind of on the anti-imperial left in Latin America, have called for, is an effective regional response. There is an irony that in this bicentenary of the first Spanish American, really, diplomatic Congress of 1826, convened by Simón Bolívar to respond to external threats, that when the region is facing a clear external threat, it has managed so little cooperation. Though actually, if you dig into what happens in 1826, this might be more a repetition or an echo of history than a break with it. So what have we seen then? If we haven't seen effective regional responses at the state-to-state level, we've seen a great deal of deference, at least in the near term, to the United States. The Shield of the Americas, again, put this on display. Indeed, that was its point. There is, as Cristina said, considerable sympathy among particular leaders, for sure, in Latin America for the broader Trump project, and particularly for certain socially conservative aspects of that. There are close networks amongst the political coalition surrounding many of these leaders, but there are also considerable reservoirs of sympathy for and cultural commonality, I think, for the United States, which makes a policy of confrontation of the United States really risky. This is something that Colombian President Gustavo Petro found out quite quickly, that there was not only a rejoinder from Donald Trump when he would push back against Trump, but there was tremendous pushback from some quite powerful sectors of Colombian society, and I think from parts of the Colombian military, which is very closely linked to counterparts in the United States. So we've seen a lot of deference. We've seen some weak, what you might call hedging. Probably Brazil is the most evident case of this. It's the country that is structurally best and relationally best positioned to engage in a degree of hedging. Chile has also done some of this, and I think in a way it's carried over between Boric and Kast, despite the significant differences between those two administrations politically. Both have engaged in a degree of trying to maintain connections with China and with the United States. We've seen some failed efforts at hedging. Again, here I think Petro stands out as someone whose efforts to push back, to balance, went beyond the structural and relational position in which Colombia finds itself. The other response that we've seen that I think gets less attention is what I would call basically ducking. That is trying to get out of the way. Panama, after being quite deferential immediately when threatened in the State of the Union address, has since then tried to do a bit of ducking and biding its time, trying to stay out of the limelight, trying to reduce its exposure to the Trump administration, but in the meantime, also trying to build up some alternatives effectively. So Panama used its position very carefully, cautiously, as an elected member of the UN Security Council to do things like advance discussions of maritime law and the neutrality of things like the Panama Canal, to build up sympathy for its position on those issues, which are effectively existential questions for Panama. So I think just to come back in closing to my argument about the role of narratives, what we've seen in terms of interventionism in the second Trump administration in Latin America and also in Iran undermines a lot of key elements of what had been really the narrative of the first Trump administration, the narrative that had been relatively successful in uniting the foreign policy elements of the sort of the Make America Great Again coalition with at least some elements of the kind of Republican Party foreign policy establishment. That is, avoiding forever wars, a bit more restrained U.S. Use of the U.S. force, which we saw in the first Trump administration. Not that there was no use of force, but not at the level that we've seen in the second administration. So Trump's intervention then in Venezuela, which I think paved the way for what was intended to be a similarly short intervention in Iran, but has instead turned into an incredibly costly, economically and politically costly quagmire in Iran, show that Trump has been losing the plot. And he's done so on purpose, in effect, by refusing to narrate interventions in the way that US foreign policy leaders typically have. And he is finding that there's a reason why they had tended to do so. That is, he's paying the costs for it. Again, thanks so much for the invitation, and I look forward to questions and conversation.
Thank you, Professor Tom. And now we have already 3 questions on the chat, and we open for the Q&A. For the ones who haven't asked any questions yet, you can do it now. And a message for the Brazilian audience. Vocês também podem fazer as perguntas em português. E a gente traduz para a eventualidade de ter alguém assistindo o evento fora do Brasil. Okay, so the first question that I have is the one by Marcília Gombata. She asks how you both analyze Brazilians' position towards the operation in Venezuela in January. Was Brazilian position enough, or could something else be done? Was there margin for a different posture by Brazil? This is Marcília's question. Daniel Butner, he's asking, past US pressure usually drove Latin American nations to cooperate against it, even right-wing governments. Why is a collective regional response missing today against these pressures? And for this set of 3 questions, I have Guilherme Caul's question. Is it possible for left-wing and centrist governments to accommodate Trump, or are they fated to deal with interference and intervention for the duration of his term? Is bargaining a possibility? These are the questions that we have for the moment. You choose who gets to answer first.
Do you want to follow the same order?
Sure, absolutely. You go right ahead. I'll rest my voice for a little bit.
Well, let's go. Well, regarding the first question by Marcília, I think that Brazil did correctly. I think that during the intervention regarding Maduro and his arrest, I think Brazil positioned himself the way he could. I think that the condemnation of unilateralism, the condemnation of intervention were enough. The problem for me regarding Brazil's stance on Venezuela is in the past. I think that Brazil was accommodating Maduro a lot during a long period of time and was put in a difficult situation when Maduro was not fulfilling the compromises that they even established with Brazil. So I think that the intervention was a reality that Brazil could not have avoided. And there was also this weight of Maduro's lack of compromise for other agreements closed. So I don't think that there was any margin for other posture. In this sense, I think that Brazilian foreign policy is dealing with the US, Trump US, in a very good manner. I had a small test published in the CEBRI magazine last year about Brazil-US relations during Trump's government in this overlapping year of 2025, when I argue that Brazil is doing what he can do and Brazil is fulfilling the agenda of his traditional foreign policy. In what sense? What do I mean by Brazilian traditional foreign policy? And it links also to the other questions that we have here from Daniel and Guilherme. Brazil is fighting for multilateralism, fighting against universalism, is trying to remain neutral in difficult situations, but also condemning not only Trump, but Israel and other countries for not abiding to international law. Brazil is negotiating with its partners in the BRICS and other alliances, but it is in an adverse world. This is a world where unstable multipolarity is very present. This is a concept that we are developing, as I mentioned, in the center of Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, that I think we need to remind that this situation here is very unstable. Sometimes it seems that we are repeating ourselves when we talk about this, but the world is very different now than it was in Trump 1. The lack of margin for other countries is real. The dependence is real, but then it's also a moment of possibilities. I also agree with Tom. I do not like to use the idea of second Cold War between China and the US. I would rather say competitive coexistence, because I think the situation for both is very different, and it's different here in Latin America as well. So I prefer the idea of coexistence, but also competitive coexistence. But it's clear for me that the destiny, the fate of the world is in the hands of US and China nowadays, and that the US has a clear view that it has no power in the economic or geoeconomic field to fight against China, especially here in Latin America. So I think this is a kind of situation where Brazilian foreign policy has, and then I come to the idea of bargaining, Brazilian foreign policy and other nations has to bargain with both nations. They're both Brazil's main partners, and this is a situation that repeats itself in whole Latin America. The point is, for you to bargain, and this I put in this article that I mentioned that is in CEBRI magazine, CEBRI journal, for you to bargain, and it's also in the book, Brazil Between Two Worlds, US and China, you have to have a national project, clear, so you know where you're going. For you to have a national project, you have to have domestic consensus, and you also have to see an expectation that the poles that are clashing have the interest in bargaining. So the US and China nowadays, they need to be interested in bargaining. I think that none of these conditions is present today. But US and China you can work with if you have the two other conditions clear: a national project and a national consensus. This is not present whatsoever. So how can you bargain with China and how can you bargain with the US if you do not know what you want? So Brazil is going to have elections in October. Both projects that are being competing now, they're very different. One, from the right, you have the idea of a neoliberal model, once more, an alignment with the US, and the other, you have the continuity of the foreign policy of fighting for multilateralism and other agendas. So how do you converge? So this is very difficult. So answering Marcília, I think that Brazil did right. Answering Guilherme, I think that we have the possibility of a bargain if we can work these things out, and if the US mostly is interested in bargaining. I don't see it in Trump, but I see a possibility. I think that Brazil did this last year, and I think he can do it again. And coming to the last block of these questions, not to take much time, why does not Latin America unite against the bully, against the US? I think this is a kind of power framework constraint. I think today Latin America is very vulnerable to both US and China power. So we are mostly dependent on these two nations. We are most vulnerable to these two nations. Both are very different. The US offers one thing, China offers others. If we may choose to cooperate with China. This for me is clear. But how do you put forward UNASUR, a Union of South American Nations again? Lula tried in the beginning of his term, of his third term. He was not able to do it because all forces in Latin America are very fragmented, elites are co-opted, and you don't have, once more, I go back to my main argument, my core argument. There's no national project. When I talk about national program, state program, we talk about a project of foreign policy, autonomous, and we have a project related to domestic policy. So the most important thing is that we cannot unite because we don't have the will and the power to do it now. And once more, I think that we are only going to have a union here once more with integration projects that really work, that go beyond the economics and work politically to deal with things such as Venezuela, such as the elections in Peru and other nations, the instability, if we have a consensus on the region about it. And if we have to understand first why all the other projects that were in place were dismantled, and the projects that were in place are still focusing only on economic issues. If we do not understand why there, backwards, almost a decade ago, all these projects were easily dismantled, we're not going to rebuild it. But my hypothesis is that there's no consensus regarding it. So we are at the mercy of time with power disputes among hegemonic powers, and we did not have to be like this. We could have, especially Brazil, a more clear policy for Brazilian development and for its foreign policy without this much upheavals. If there is another government next year, maybe foreign policy will change again. Thank you.
Great. Just to add a few things to those responses. In terms of Brazil's response, I agree. It was sort of correct, certainly, and kind of following, pointing to violations of international law, kind of calling for international law, multilateralism to be respected and followed. Though it was quite correct in that sense, I think there was also a decision that there were not going to be a lot of costs paid for trying to follow this policy, which is, again, probably a pretty reasonable decision. But so while Brazil takes this quite correct stance, it was also done with a degree of caution and with some aversion to paying high costs for following that. And I think part of the reason for that, and part of the reason for the lack of joint response elsewhere in responding to Venezuela in particular, though, there are aspects of this for Cuba increasingly in a way that differ from Cuba's historic role within the region as a beacon of anti-imperialism. But with Venezuela in particular, Maduro was the perfect target. He was the perfect target because he had burned every bridge in Latin America, as Cristina pointed out. He effectively had no friends, even amongst those who had perhaps been ideologically sympathetic to Chavismo. Maduro himself had no friends left in the region. And Venezuela had no friends in Washington. And that's quite different than Colombia, for example, or Sheinbaum in Mexico, where even though perhaps Gustavo Petro doesn't have many friends in Washington, Colombia does, and the Colombian government does. And that matters quite a bit for the calculations in launching an intervention of that sort. importantly, I think, Cuba doesn't have a lot of friends in Washington. It used to have a lot of friends in the region, or at least sympathizers. Some of that remains kind of as a historical legacy, but I think much of that sympathy has effectively eroded for the Cuban government, and that's a real problem. They're much more astute than Maduro was, but they don't have this deep reserve of sympathy across the region, which Cuba, even in the 1990s, was really able to call on and to instrumentalize. And then from the U.S. perspective, the intervention against Maduro was the perfect target because the Venezuelan intervention was like a Christmas tree for the Trump coalition. There was a president for everyone under it. For the anti-migration people, Venezuela is a huge source of immigration, and so they could point at that. And Stephen Miller in the White House, one of the first things he does is increase the number of deportation flights to Venezuela, and gets Delcy Rodriguez to agree to that right off the bat. For the China hawks, going after Venezuela looked like taking out a top Chinese ally. For economic interests, they could promise oil and minerals. And of course, for Marco Rubio's coalition, this was a great move against Cuba, as it has turned out to be an absolute blow to the Cuban government and to the Cuban population. So I think all of those things made the intervention a little bit more difficult for Brazil to oppose outside or beyond this kind of rhetorically, internationally, legally correct way. Why are you going to pay heavy costs to defend Maduro after he burned every bridge you tried to build to him? In terms of the second question from Daniel about kind of collective regional responses, I guess I would maybe question the premise of the question a little bit. That is, I'm not quite as convinced that past U.S. pressure has actually always led to such a great degree of cooperation. I think there's often been a kind of a historic narrative around this, and this is why I was mentioning 1826 as sort of what gets pointed to as the first instance of this. But coming out of 1826, basically nobody ratifies the agreements, and then there's a breakdown in regional cooperation, and it's not until kind of the 1860s when 1826 takes on this meaning. The Panama Congress takes on this meaning as a point of departure for what is then beginning to be thought of as Latin American regionalism. And after that, lots of times U.S. pressure has been quite effective at dividing. So yes, there are some kind of joint responses to Cuba, but if you go back to, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a lot of sympathy for the U.S. position. And then that led to kind of a third way position in trying to negotiate what eventually becomes the Treaty of Tlatelolco to remove nuclear weapons. But initially, it was not kind of rallying around Cuba exactly. And so, I think there actually sort of this diversity of Latin American responses is probably a more historically common pattern than sort of a tight regional response. There are instances of a regional response, but probably more of fragmentation because there are diverse interests at stake effectively. In terms of accommodation or bargaining, I think there is room for bargaining, but maybe not on the most salient issue all of the time. That is, it's really important, and this is kind of my argument about small states more generally in my work on small states, is that small states, and by that I mean the relatively weaker state in an asymmetrical relation, so you can think about much of Latin America in this sense, small states have to respond to a set of constraints a particular context. But within that context, they can find opportunities. So when issues are less salient for the great power, when there are perhaps divisions within the United States about how to approach an issue, those sorts of factors provide opportunities for small states, whether they're left-wing or centrist or on the right, to effectively pursue their priorities vis-a-vis a great power. So, you know, are the kind of individual states in Latin America going to remake the entire shape of kind of the international system or the US role in the region? Probably not. Are they able to identify and pursue particular foreign policy interests? Yes, I think so. Again, I agree with Cristina here. You know, having something like a national project is important. I think you could also look at the United States and the division within it and ask, you know, to what extent does the United States have at this moment a national project? There's certainly some agreement that there must be a response to China, but there is not a national project that defines what that response is going to be. If there were, you would see much greater coordination in trying to do things like have a US alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, the attempts at that have been incredibly short-lived, poorly funded, not priorities for the United States, and really not priorities in Congress, that is, to fund where the money comes from. And so, you know, I think in a sense that lack of a national project in the United States probably opens up some opportunities for the strategic pursuit of particular goals on behalf of Latin American states.
Oh, thank you. Given the time we had agreed, we have to close now the discussion. But in the name of São Paulo University International Relations Research Center, I would like to thank you both, Professor Tom Long and Professor Cristina Pecequilo, for this incredible discussion we had this morning or this afternoon. And thank you so much, the audience, for being here. And I think this is it. Thank you so very much. And bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paulo.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.